at AAR. Now welcome to the stage our next guest. I wish we had welcoming music as you came up on the. Great to see you, Bruce. Thank you so much. Have a seat. We've been talking about you a lot this morning, and I've been sort of saying, hey, what do I talked to Ian Jeffries. What do you most want out of Bruce Westerman? And they're all saying, well, he's the keeper of permit reform and all sorts of authorizations. But so folks know, Bruce is congressman from Arkansas. He's very, very involved in transportation issues and questions. And so let me just start out and say, what's highest on your radar screen right now?
Permitting reform.
And tell us why.
Because it affects everything from infrastructure and transportation to energy, to meeting the demands that we have in our country right now. We have to have permitting and regulatory reform if we're going to meet the challenges that are in front of us.
Now, you are on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. What's the literacy level of your colleagues, and you're both around this broad question? I mean, you're talking about permitting reform, and we've been talking about how we're stuck in regulatory structures that were fashioned 50 years ago, 60 years ago, even longer than that. And I'm just, I'm always interested in the question. We can always find a member of Congress like yourself who wants to say, hey, we need to be more enlightened. We need to do this and this. But it's hard to get a sense of the decibel level of urgency. And how urgent is this, do you feel, among your colleagues?
And this has to be bipartisan because it has to get 20 votes in the Senate. And I'm seeing more urgency for it now than I've ever seen. We made a run at it about this time last year with Senator Manchin and Barrasso. And we never could get across the finish line, but the work on it hasn't stopped and the urgency for it hasn't stopped. One of the things that's probably driving more people to think about it now than ever before is the advent of the data centers and AI technology, the tremendous amount of energy that those facilities use, and the realization that we are really behind where we need to be in having the infrastructure and the energy capacity to power those data centers. And we're not just a little bit behind. There's a data center that's planned for North Louisiana that will actually take some power out of Arkansas, that it needs 3 gigabytes of energy. To put that in perspective, I've got some nuclear power plants in my district. Each one of those plants is a gigabyte. So you need 3 nuclear power plants to run 1 data center. That's the kind of energy demand that we're seeing, and the increases for electricity and the projection for that are astronomical. And this is coming at a time where we've shut down a lot of coal plants, we're building gas plants, but we can't get the infrastructure and the energy supplies fast enough to meet the demand for these data centers.
So in permitting reform, I was very familiar with what Joe Manchin and John Barrasso were trying to push forward in this. And of course, you had different sides. I mean, sometimes you have permitting questions and challenges for legitimate issues on environment, legitimate issues on the other side. How do you best get that equilibrium right? And I'll give you an example. Recently, I was in, where were we, Naharka? We were down in Dallas, and we did a big thing with Encore Energy, the biggest utility energy supplier in the state. And I think we had Siemens and NVIDIA and Dell looking at this. And this guy from Encore said Texas is going to dominate this industry on data centers in the future because it only takes us 6 months to get permits through. And so we're faster than anywhere else in the country. So he framed it in terms of permitting. But I'm interested in the other side of the debate. How do you think you got to get the equilibrium right of interests?
So everybody has to realize what's at stake. So it's an educational exercise, which I need y'all's help with that. We need every stakeholder in the country should be here in DC making the case for permitting reform on both sides of the aisle. Energy gets a lot of the focus because of the demands for AI and data centers. But McKinsey Group put out a study in July, y'all may have seen this, that it analyzed projects that were delayed in the NEPA process over a 4-year window. And as you know, it takes an average of 4.7 years to get a NEPA permit right now. So they looked at public infrastructure projects held up in a 4-year window, and the price tag they put on that to the American taxpayer was $2.7 trillion. That's public infrastructure. Throw on top of that all the energy and the transmission, put in mining, which is a whole issue in itself because of our dependence on foreign countries.
It's 20 years for a mine.
Yeah, you're talking decades in getting a permit for mining. The average public infrastructure project's over 6 years. All NEPA combined is 4.7. There's some data saying it's dropped down to 4.2. But there was a great piece written by George Will last week talking about a book that I've ordered the book. I'm looking forward to reading, a guy named Philip Howard. It's called Saving America's Can Do. And when we're talking about innovation, look at all the great things our country has done. I was giving a speech back in Arkansas earlier this week, and I like to refer to this quote that's in the House chamber. It's the only quote in the House chamber. It says, "Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, promote all its great ideas, and see whether or not we too in our day and generation can do something worthy to be remembered." Think about the great ideas that this country has had. I mean, we invented the hamburger, the light bulb, telegraph, radio, TV, computer, the internet,
Fantastic railway
GPS,
system.
railway systems. Yeah. And it's because people have been able to innovate, but we're destroying the fabric of what made our country great by putting this wet blanket of regulatory and permitting. And my chief, y'all may know Nancy Pill. If you do, you'll understand this. But one of her favorite sayings is, "Are you an American or an American?" And we're becoming Americans because we can't innovate and we can't bring these new ideas to the table. We still outperform the rest of the world and everything, but we can't think we're going to keep tying our hands behind our back and putting our feet in concrete and thinking we're going to beat the rest of the world.
Bruce, you're pushing the SPEED Act. That's what your legislation called, the SPEED Act. I'm really interested in the transportation dimensions of that, because we've been talking this morning about a national transportation system that kind of wants to absorb technology, take advantage of many of the new technologies that come forward to be better in this, and they're dealing with it's kind of like, the difference, in my book between a medieval age in the 70s or 60s and a Renaissance, but I'm interested in what the SPEED Act would do to bring the Enlightenment forward in transportation.
Well, it makes NEPA work as a process. Speaking of rail, there was a very important decision that came out of Utah and the 7 counties decision that involved a railroad, where the Supreme Court said NEPA can't dictate outcomes. NEPA is a process that's used to analyze the underlying environmental statutes. That's what it's supposed to be. It's grown into its own animal. The engineer in me thinks of NEPA, and I see a flow chart when I think of NEPA. Easy routes, a categorical exclusion. Then you go to an environmental assessment, and the world can go crazy from there if you hit an environmental impact statement. But even if you make it through the current really messed up maze of NEPA and you get your record of decision, there's 6 years after you start construction on a project where somebody can file a suit in an Article 3 court, get an injunction, and shut your project down. That's happening all over the country right now. That throws a massive hindrance on investors' attitude towards wanting to build things here in the country, when you've got capital that you need to spend to get a return on it, and you're in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm going to spend 4 years or longer to get a permit. Then when I get the permit and I actually start spending real money, this project can still be shut down. It's asinine to think that we've let a system like that come into play, and that we, as my friend Scott Peters, who's working with me on permitting reform, says, Moses didn't write NEPA on stone tablets. It's something we can.
Is that a Scott Peters line?
It is, yeah. I'll credit him.
And for those who don't know, Scott's from San Diego, and so he's down near our friend Matt. We're in Southern California, and Southern California is very interesting because it's a place with a quality of life, but regulation, but they care a lot, Ian, about their rails. I mean, tons about their rails. So in the broad side of this with permitting, I'm interested in the others around this, like than Scott Peters. I remember during the Manchin Barrasso effort, even some surprising voices like Ro Khanna was supportive of some elements of permitting reform. How deep is the bipartisanship around this issue? And if it is deep, why can't it move at the speed of speed?
Yeah. And I think it is moving. So Jared Golden from Maine is the Democrat Maine co-sponsor. He's on the Natural Resources Committee, which we have jurisdiction over NEPA. And as we add a Democrat, we're adding more Republicans. The problem's not going to be getting Republican votes on NEPA reform or on the SPEED Act. The problem's going to be getting 60 votes in the Senate. To get 60 votes in the Senate, we need as many Democrats in the House on board. So I could write a red meat permitting reform bill that I would think is perfect, that I could get passed out of the House, that probably never would go anywhere in the Senate. The perfect permitting reform bill is the one that gets to the president's desk and he signs it. So we've got to be open to working across the aisle, or we're not going to get permitting reform done. And my approach to it has been that permitting should be a blind process. And when I say a blind process, it shouldn't pick winners and losers based on technology or industry. It should just simply be a process that people can go through the process, check all the boxes, make sure they've got the environmental safeguards in place. And I'll challenge you to find somebody that's a bigger conservationist in Congress than I am. My graduate degree is in forestry. I think I understand environmentalism and conservation. We're doing more harm to the environment by not permitting projects than we are by holding them up and creating this morass. If we want to do something good for the environment and good for the economy, we'll do permitting reform so that we can innovate and make cleaner, safer, healthier forms of transportation, of energy, and of all the great things that we do in our country that, again, are being held up because we can't get through the paperwork and the red tape.
One of the things I asked Ian Jeffries to do up here was to sort of paint a picture of what could be in rail and transport as you brought technology in. And I kind of just listening to you in this, thinking about data centers, AI coming on, all of this, you imagine, trying to paint a picture of what the future of mobility in all of its forms could look like 20 years from now is a pretty neat thing if you kind of, have this Disney-esque, look of this. And I always wonder what is keeping us from getting to that picture, or what might keep us from getting there. And I'm just interested, Congressman, in the people you're listening to and talking to, interfacing with. Is that picture clear of what the opportunities are in the future? Or are we kind of trapped in an incrementalism that doesn't have much vision?
I think one of the problems in DC is we don't have long-term visions. I joke, my undergraduate's engineering, where we were taught to think with logic and reason, and then I studied forestry, where you look at long-term horizons, and I say those are the worst two educational backgrounds you can have to serve in Congress, because neither of those things are appreciated. But we've got to look at a long-term horizon on where are we going to be in the future, and how do we get there, and when do we get there? Because things are changing at a very rapid pace, and we've got to have policies that align with the ability of our economy to react fast and to build things and to bring those new technologies into place. And
part of this is, it's interesting. There are lots of different transportation. There are bicycles. My friend Alan Greenberg is here. He works for the Department of Transportation. Apparently, he is not working. He is still working down the road. But Alan, I want to come over to you because this is the guy in Washington, D.C., whether you like them or not, who created all the bike lanes. I mean, he transformed mobility in this city with the bike lanes. And when he first started it, I thought he would never. That's not Alan. Alan is a little bit further. But Alan, I want to give you an opportunity to pose a question. And also, as we kind of think, no, further back. Alan, smile at Sammy. There we go.
So,
and it's great to have you here, Alan, and any other Department of Transportation people here.
The first thing I should say is I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Transportation. But I think one of the tensions in this space, and I'd be curious if you could. So a lot of innovations across the board have been troubled by overuse of some regulations. Bike lanes, for instance, and facility improvements in San Francisco were delayed for many, many years because of CEQA, the California version of NEPA. But I think one of the tensions one always hears is how do we make sure the process can work on things that are not good, things that really do have extremely negative impacts, while at the same time moving forward quickly things that are good. And maybe your bill contemplates some of that.
Yeah, we don't want to make it easier to destroy the environment. We want to have the same rigorous standards. We're not talking about changes to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, to FERC or ESA or Marine Mammal Protection or the Historic Preservation Act. Now, that's not in speed right now. There are some things that need to be changed in those laws as well. But what we want is a process that evaluates the statutes in those underlying environmental regulations and does it quickly. The answer may be no, but that's a better answer than maybe. And that's what we keep giving investors is, well, maybe you can do this. Just keep spending money and studying it more, and let's go to another agency and get them to check off. Coming from the private sector, it was always better to get yes or no, and then you can move on and go from there. You may not like no, and you may want to challenge it in court, but at least get to yes or no more quickly. But don't water down the standards that you've got to meet.
One of the things Bruce, thank you so much for joining us this morning. But one of the things I found interesting about Alan's world, because you were basically saying, hey, bike lanes were a victim of a lot of this as well. But I'm also interested in the other side because I know that world, and we kind of talk about the whole totality of mobility, which is part of what we're doing today, not just railways, is that you brought data, you brought design and advanced thinking. I remember talking to Rahm Emanuel, he was mayor of Chicago, saying, hey, we learned something from data from FedEx trucks on how our trucks, they saved a lot of money, which he then helped transfer that money to schools. So data, bringing advanced methodologies and AI to these various things. And what I find interesting about the conversation today is there are some modes of transportation that are not allowed to bring what they're learning into that system, right? That's part of what they're doing. So I'd be interested as they're telling their story, Bruce, and you're engaged in the SPEED Act and pushing, what would you like to see those folks in the transportation, writ large, do to help move this agenda forward?
That's a great question, and I think everybody's got different stories that they can tell. The main thing is to tell the story, and to come here to DC. I'm always, or here recently, I like to tell about the.
Do you ever get to go home?
I live on an airplane, I think, but the Sandstone and Gravel Association came here 2 weeks ago, and they were in my office, and they said, Congressman, we've got 300 people on the Hill today. We're going to every Senate office and every House office, and the SPEED Act is our #1 priority.
Wow.
If we can build if everybody realizes they're in the coalition,
right,
how many people that are affected by permitting and regulatory issues, and get all those groups activated and come here and tell about how, look, we had this data, we showed this was actually going to be good for the environment, and we couldn't do the project because it got held up in CEQA in this instance. And I will say California is the only state I travel to where people say, will you please regulate us? Saying, will the federal government please step in and regulate California so that we can get out from under the state regulations? Most states are saying, help us get out from under the burden of the federal regulations. But everybody across the country's got a story about how permitting has delayed a project. And in most instances, you can show how this project would have been better for the environment. I'm very passionate about forestry. That's an area where we're putting more carbon in the atmosphere through poor choices on forest management. We're burning up iconic trees like the giant sequoias, which they're only found in about 70 groves in California, because we can't go in and apply the science that we know works to make forests healthy because of NEPA regulations. And
Do you ever go to
burdensome
Nebraska?
process. Yeah, the home of.
When's the last time you were there?
I almost went for the college baseball World Series, but my
Well, I've got
Razorbacks
somebody who
beat.
can help with the next trip.
Yeah.
Let's walk. So first of all, let's thank Congressman Bruce Westerman for joining us today, and let me introduce you to Senator Deb Fisher. Senator Fisher, come on up from Nebraska. Great to see you.